Resident Evil 1996. A survival horror video game developed and published by Capcom originally for the PlayStation. Players control Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, members of the elite task force STARS, who must escape a mansion infested with zombies and other monsters. Conceived by producer Tokoro Fujiwara as a remake of his earlier horror game Sweet Home, it went through several redesigns, first as a Super SNES game in 1993, and then a fully 3D first-person PlayStation game in 1994, and finally a third-person game. Resident Evil 2, 1998. The player controls Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield, who must escape Raccoon City after its citizens are transformed into zombies by Umbrella's T-Virus 2 months after the events of the original Resident Evil. The main difference from its predecessor are the branching paths, with each player character having unique storylines, partners, and obstacles. Resident Evil 3. This takes place almost concurrently with the events of Resident Evil 2. The player must control former elite agent Jill Valentine, the same Jill Valentine from the first game, as she escapes from a city that has been infected by Umbrella's T-Virus, this being the same Raccoon City as Resident Evil 2. The game uses the same engine as its predecessors and features 3D models over pre-rendered backgrounds with fixed camera angles, just like the first two games. Choices through the game affect how the story unfolds and which ending is achieved. Resident Evil 3 was designed to have a more action-orientated gameplay than its predecessors, and features a larger number of enemies for the players to defeat. Resident Evil Survivor. This is a first-person light gun shooter game developed by TOS and published by Capcom. The game takes place after the missile explosion that wiped out the contaminated Raccoon City at the end of Resi 2 and Resi 3. Not long after this incident, a helicopter crashes on the outskirts of Umbrella Corporation's private township located on Sheena Island. The pilot escapes the burning wreckage, only to find himself fighting a battle against the living dead, with no memory of his identity or his reasons for being there. As the first release of the Gun Survivor series within Resident Evil, this game was a major difference from the main Resident Evil series, substituting the third-person perspective of the previous games to a first-person view. The Japanese and European versions of the game were compatible with Namco's Guncon G-Con 45 light gun attachment for the PlayStation hardware, making it one of the first off-rail light gun games. Resident Evil Code Veronica, 2000. The story takes place 3 months after the events of Resident Evil 2 and the concurrent destruction of Raccoon City as seen in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. It follows Claire Redfield and her brother Chris Redfield in their efforts to survive a viral outbreak at a remote prison island in the Southern Ocean and a research facility in Antarctica. The game retains the traditional survival horror controls and gameplay of previous installments. However, unlike the pre-rendered backgrounds of previous games, Code Veronica uses 3D real-time environments and dynamic camera movement. After producer Shinji Mikami and his team learned that they would be unable to port Resident Evil 2 to the Sega Saturn, they then began development on an original game, which became Code Veronica. Resident Evil Gaiden. Resident Evil Gaiden is an action-adventure game for the Game Boy Color, developed by Capcom and M4, released in 2001. Receiving generally mixed reviews by critics, the game marks a departure from other entries in the series, insofar as areas are explored with the playable character seen from a top-down perspective, and with battles fought in first-person view. The story revolves around a viral outbreak on a passenger ship and has Leon S. Kennedy and Barry Burton return as protagonists. The game is non-canon, however, as its storyline is contradicted by the main series in key parts, and its events are ignored. Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica. This is a light gun shooter video game developed and published by Capcom like normal. The arcade version was developed in conjunction with Namco for the arcade machines. It was released on the PlayStation 2 in 2001. The game is adapted from Resident Evil Code Veronica and features enemies and characters from that game and enemies from Resident Evil 2 or 3. But the plot is revealed to be a dream that Claire is experiencing after the events of the main Code Veronica game. Resident Evil 0, developed and published by Capcom, like normal, in 2002. It is a prequel to Resident Evil 1, covering the ordeals experienced in the Arklay Mountains by a special force unit, the STARS Bravo team. The story follows Officer Rebecca Chambers and convict Billy Cohen as they explore an abandoned training facility for employees of the pharmaceutical company Umbrella. The gameplay is similar to other Resident Evil games, but adds the ability to switch between characters to solve puzzles and use unique abilities. Development for Resident Evil 0 began for the Nintendo 64 in 1998. The partner system was created to take advantage of the short load times possible with the capabilities of the N64 game pack. Resident Evil Remake. This is a survival horror game developed by Capcom Production Studio 4 and published by Capcom. Released for the GameCube in 2002, it is a remake of the 1996 PlayStation game Resident Evil. It was directed by Shinji Mikami, who also directed and designed the original Resident Evil. Mikami decided to produce a remake because he felt that the original had not aged well enough and that the GameCube's capabilities could bring it closer to his original vision. The game retains the same graphical presentation with 3D models superimposed over pre-rendered backgrounds, however the quality of the graphics has vastly improved. The remake also features new gameplay mechanics, revised puzzles, additional explorable areas, a revised script, and new story details, including an entire subplot cut from the original game. Resident Evil Dead Aim. This is a light gun shooter video game developed by Kavia and published by Capcom. It is also the first in the franchise to feature first-person shooting and third-person movements seen in its predecessors in the Resident Evil series. 4 years after the Raccoon City incident, the Umbrella-owned ocean liner, Spencer Rain, has been infested by the T-virus stolen by Umbrella's Paris labs by bioterrorist and former Umbrella employee Morpheus D. Duval, and its secret BOW, that means bioorganic weapon, cargo intentionally released. Bruce McGivern, a member of the USS TRA-TCOM, which is a anti-Umbrella pursuit investigation team, is sent to save the world. Resident Evil Outbreak. This was released in 2003 for the PlayStation 2, developed by Capcom Production Studio 1, and is the first entry in the Resident Evil video game series to feature cooperative gameplay and online multiplayer support. Outbreak depicts a series of episodic storylines in a zombie-inhabited Raccoon City. Players control 8 characters with unique abilities. It was set during the same general time period as Resident Evil 2 and 3. The game was praised for its graphics, fun factor, and multiplayer, but criticised for the lack of voice chat. Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 is the sequel to Resident Evil Outbreak. It was released for PlayStation 2 in 2004. Following the success of Outbreak in Japan, Capcom announced File 2 in late 2004. The same 8 characters from the first title return with similar abilities, and the game once again takes place in a zombie-inhabited Raccoon City. Resident Evil 4. Developed by Capcom Production Studio 4 and published by Capcom. It was originally released for the GameCube in 2005. Players control US government special agent Leon S. Kennedy, who is sent on a special mission to rescue the US President's daughter, Ashley Graham, who has been kidnapped by a cult. In rural Spain, Leon fights hordes of villagers infected by a mind-controlling parasite and reunites with the spy Ada Wong from Resident Evil 2. In a departure from the fixed camera angles and slower survival horror gameplay of previous Resident Evil games, the team focused on developing more dynamic shooting action. Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles. This is an on-rails light gun shooter video game developed by Capcom and Kavia. The game was released for the Wii on November 13, 2007. The game exposes Umbrella Corporation's meddling throughout the Resident Evil series through narration from Albert Wesker, a former Umbrella scientist, and hidden documents pertaining to the organization's secret motives and actions. The game is composed of 5 scenarios that recapitulate the events of Resident Evil 0, the Resident Evil remake, and Resident Evil 3, as well as new material pertaining to the Umbrella Corporation's overall downfall. Resident Evil 5 is a third-person shooter video game developed and published by Capcom. The plot involves an investigation of a terrorist threat by Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance agents Chris Redfield and Shiva Alamar in Kijuju, a fictional region of West Africa. Chris learns that he must confront his past in the form of an old enemy, Albert Wesker, and his former partner, Jill Valentine. The gameplay of Resident Evil 5 is similar to Resident Evil 4, though it is the first in the series designed for two-player cooperative gameplay. It has also been considered the first in the main series to depart from the survival horror genre, with critics saying it bore more resemblance to an action game. Resident Evil The Darkside Chronicles is an on-rails light gun shooter for the Wii, developed by Capcom and Cavia. The game was released on the Wii in 2009. It serves as a prequel to Resident Evil 4, set 2 years before its events. The game's plot revolves around the retelling of the personal stories of the protagonists of Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica. Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D. This is a third-person shooter video game developed just by Capcom for the Nintendo 3DS, and was released in 2011. A combination of the Mercenaries minigame featured in Resident Evil 4 and 5, players must defeat as many enemies as possible within the time limit. Resident Evil Revelations, developed and published by Capcom in 2012, originally for the 3DS. Set shortly after the events of Resident Evil 4, the game follows counter-terrorism agents Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield as they try to uncover the truth behind a bioterrorist organisation that plans to infect the Earth's oceans with a virus. The game features a single-player mode where the player must complete a series of episodes that involve solving puzzles and defeating enemies, and a multiplayer mode where players may fight their way through altered single-player scenarios. It was designed to bring back the content and horror of the Resident Evil roots, while at the same time trying to modernise the gameplay. Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City is a squad-based third-person shooter game, co-developed by Slant 6 Games and Capcom. It is set around the same time as Resident Evil 2 and 3 and features the characters from these two games, though it is non-canon and a hypothetical scenario. The game follows a group of elite paramilitary mercenaries for the Umbrella Corporation during the zombie outbreak in Raccoon City. Resident Evil 6 is a 2012 third-person shooter. Players control Leon S. Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Jake Muller, and Ada Wong as they confront the force behind a worldwide bioterrorist attack. The story is centered around their 4 interwoven campaigns, and every campaign features a unique style in both tone and gameplay. Resident Evil 6 was conceptualized in 2009 and entered full development the following year under Resident Evil 4 producer Hiroyuki Kobayashi. Resident Evil Revelations 2. It marks the return of Claire Redfield as the protagonist, and the first time Barry Burton is a playable story character in the main series. The plot is set between the events of Resident Evil 5 and 6. The story begins when Claire and her co-workers, including Barry Burton's daughter Moira Burton, are at a party in the headquarters of the NGO TerraSave when they are attacked by unknown assailants and taken away to a deserted island in the Baltic Sea. Umbrella Corps is a 2016 tactical shooter game developed and published by Capcom. The single-player portion, named The Experiment, follows an agent named 3A7. He is sent on missions by his superiors in order to test out new equipment, such as the Zombie Jammer. Although the Umbrella Corporation has been disbanded, a great deal of valuable bio-organic weapons, that's BOWs, research information left over from their past evil endeavours is still waiting to be discovered. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is a 2017 survival horror game developed and published by Capcom. The player controls Ethan Winters as he searches for his long-missing wife in a derelict plantation occupied by an infected family, solving puzzles and fighting enemies. Resident Evil 7 diverges from the more action-orientated Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6, returning to the franchise's survival horror roots, emphasizing exploration. Resident Evil 7 is the first full-length game to use Capcom's in-house RE engine. The development was led by Koshi Nakanishi, director of the 2012 Nintendo 3DS game Resident Evil Revelations. The team took inspiration from the 1981 The Evil Dead, scaled back the game to one location, and used a first-person perspective to immerse players. 2 downloadable content scenarios were released, Not a Hero and End of Zoe. Resident Evil 2 Remake is a 2019 survival horror game developed and published by Capcom and is a remake of the original Resident Evil 2. Capcom first considered remaking Resident Evil 2 following the release of the remake of the first Resident Evil in 2002, but was delayed as a series creator, Shinji Mikami, did not want to divert development from the then upcoming Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 3 Remake is a 2020 survival horror game developed and published by Capcom and is a remake of Resident Evil 3 from 1999. The development is played from a third-person perspective and requires the player to solve puzzles and defeat monsters while being pursued by a creature named Nemesis, just like Resident Evil 3. Most of the Resident Evil 3 remake was developed concurrently with the 29 remake of Resident Evil 2, and both games run on Capcom's RE engine. The developers revamped the movement speed and animations from the Resi 2 remake and added the ability to dodge. Resident Evil Resistance. This is a 2020 survival horror game developed by Neobards Entertainment and published by Capcom. It involves 4 survivor players competing against a mastermind player who can create traps, enemies, and other hazards. The game takes place in 1998, just before or during the Raccoon City destruction incident, where civilians have been abducted by the Umbrella Intelligence Division. Sent to the Nest 2 facility, they are forced to fight a number of mutants on behalf of senior Umbrella employees to prove the effectiveness of Umbrella's T-Virus project. Resident Evil Village. A 2021 survival horror game developed and published by Capcom. It is the sequel to Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Players control Ethan Winters, who searches for his kidnapped daughter in a village filled with mutant creatures. Village maintains the survival horror elements from previous Resident Evil games, with players scavenging environments for items and managing resources. However, it adds more action-orientated gameplay, with higher enemy counts and a greater emphasis on combat. Thank you for watching that, everybody. If you liked the sound of this and you want me to cover something else in the Resident Evil world, whether that's lore, video games, movies, or comic books, anything like that, tell me below. My name is George, this is Jam Punch, and I will see you next time.